Hello, everyone. Well, it's hot here in the backyard in my house in uh, Ripon, Wisconsin, where I'm battling some mosquitoes, but I wanted to get outside to make you a quick video. Um, and just to give you a heads up, I leave in the morning for 3 weeks of Spanish training in Costa Rica. I'll be in internet touch Monday morning and then throughout the day. So if you have any, problems or questions, not a thing. You'll get your exams back, and you have an essay to write. And I haven't checked today to see if anybody had turned it in. A couple of you have written asking me about, well, what are we supposed to do? And if you go back over and look at the syllabus, and there's a video there, I believe it was with um, the week that we read, probably week 4, which would be the Carbon Diaries. Talked about it there, but also, and the critical analysis fits in here with what it does with the regular class I teach in children's literature. And so I've pointed you to essays there, in particular, a couple good ones. One on the wonderful piece, The Iron Giant, which was turned into a cartoon most of you will know. Um, Basically, 3 to 3.5 pages, double spaced. And what I don't want is a plot summary. Don't tell me about one of the books. We all read them. We know what happened. You want, in all instances, from the very first paragraph, to be involved with significance. So what if the the government has these harvest homes where people go and they're unwound and things like that? Doesn't mean anything. Plot detail. If in fact, though, you're talking about corporate takeover and the manner in which these the whole new laws, all the laws that are written are usurped in basically in behalf of the top 10% or 1% who get all the best body parts and things along those lines, something that's developed further in the books that follow Unwind. You can talk about those kinds of things. You can talk about that corporate kinds of things. In terms of power in the Hunger Games, you're going to find it too in virtually everything we've talked about. Some manifestation of that. And in as much as we're talking about dystopian literature, we know, is because you've read, that most of these stories have to do with the uses and abuses of technology. Um, Virtually all the books move in that direction. Even something that doesn't seem quite like that is The Knife of Never Letting Go. Um, in this case, it's a different kind of takeover, if you will, all about the use of information. Which, by the way, if you think about it in terms of the noise and all that, what are we to believe, is not much different than what goes on with all the noises we have on social media and these kinds of things. To ferret out what represents the truth is a very difficult thing to do. Well, you can look in many, many different directions on these stories, and I mean, I'm not giving you write about this because I want you to use your imagination. Now, all of you wrote, most of you wrote probably on the Hunger Games for the exam. At least those that I've looked at so far have. Um, if you didn't, there are other topics that I presented for the Hunger Games, and also the fourth novel we read. And if you didn't use one of them for the midterm, you're welcome to use it for your essay. Um, but the idea here is to narrow the focus into to something with which you can deal with in a specific terms for 3 pages. Now, it might be a character analysis. If you're going to take someone like Connor, you're going to say, well, I'm going to do an analysis of Connor, about his growth and whatnot. That's fine. But you have to tie your analysis of Connor in with what you see are the novels, some of the novel's major threads or important aspects of the novel, from the fact of what happens to people when they're chosen, when they're AWOL, what that means in terms of the society. Why is, for instance, is Connor so famous? What has he done? And that will suggest to you some of the things you want to look into in terms of his growth. By the end, he takes a stand, he learns a few things, and he's very much a mature individual. He's reached his potential. You can also look at that in terms of gender. This is especially true in something like the knife of never letting go, where you have our young boy Matt, who's never even seen a woman, and yet he comes to defend Viola. At one point, he says she's her own person. And he comes a long way. There's a reason this novel won a big award for its portrayal of men and women. It's called Gender Bending. Uh, and you can look at that. You can look at the role of technology in terms of ecology. Um, we don't know, we assume that that's one of the reasons that one of the things that destroyed Panem to begin with, had to do with the wars, and we see the devastation there. Um, but the real things with ecology come through. Ecology come through in a book like The Carbon Diaries, and the last book we read in particular, and of course the Knife of Never Letting Go, because it turns out that the new inhabitants of the planet um, did themselves in and destroyed their own selves after they got there. They couldn't cope with what was called the chaos, and the aliens there, the spackle. Of course, the story is that the spackle gave the disease, and the war went on. Well, it turns out that none of that is true, really, in the long run. And we know the spackle are there, but they're stay away from humans, given what the humans did to them. And so you have these other kinds of things about communication going on there that are of no small interest in the novel or the universe of the novel. The novel in the series, and for crying out loud, the name escapes me right now. That also has to do with a global um, ecological catastrophe, and you see Gaia, which is in people, so the touchy-feely people or the leftists are always talking about Gaia as the goddess, or which it's the controlling deity of the world. Um, and when you're reading that story, one of the things that's interesting about it is that the young girl, the main central protagonist, the protagonist, excuse me, um, doesn't get it. It's the parents who do. But you can see there, again, this idea of the corporate takeover. Um, and you can look and see what's taught in schools and the kinds of controls that are used and how technology is abused for the benefit of often of the few, to be sure, but also is this idea of this promise of security. This is brought up quite well in our book, Little Brother, which of course is a diminutive of Big Brother, which is 1984. But I mean, it's looking at the questions that's of no small importance to us is abuses in things like a Patriot Act. As long as the person in power, you trust that person not to go to extremes, it's okay. But then what happens when something else happens, or what happens when a part of the government runs rather amok, as the Snowden papers indicated was going on with the security agencies? And this is what Cory Doctorow's writing about. Whether you think that in any circumstances torture is worth it, as look at what happened to the French nation after they did it with all their liberty, equality, and fraternity, and torture during the Algerian War, and the country still hasn't recovered from doing what the enemy did. But that doesn't matter. The idea is here we can see the abuses that take place, not only because of the government agencies, but you come to find out other agencies like Blackwater in Iran and Iraq, excuse me, and places like that, who go to the extremes working for the government, and this theme's developed in the second book of called Homeland. Um, but there you have the idea of not just security, but privacy. And in the United States, and in the world of science fiction, to be sure, since the 50s, um, the, the questions about, before the 50s, early, right up to the 60s, most science fiction wasn't really dystopic. Matter of fact, the idea was of the great frontier, with its Western motif, in the words that made famous by John F. Kennedy, and going to the moon and whatnot. The idea was technology is going to solve everything for us. Science is going to help and solve everything. Well, after World War II, and the advent of the atomic age, if you will, um, certain ambivalence. I mean, a guy like Oppenheimer doesn't want the hydrogen bomb built. A lot of the science who are involved in the creation of the atomic bomb don't look too good, after the dropping of the bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Many of the scientists, indeed, were concerned with the spread of weapons, which, by the way, if you look at what's going on in Iran, is still with us today, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And the Iran is a great example of this. If you refine uranium to the point where you can use it for the research, for the reactors and those kinds of things, once you get to that point, it's dual-use technologies. You can go the other way and make a bomb, which is why the issue with how many centrifuges they're allowed and things like this. Um, Everything's like that in the world of technology. The technology itself, as you're going to find in most of these stories, is not necessarily evil or bad. It's how it's used. And this goes back forever. you know, but as I say, power corrupts, and ultimate power corrupts completely. And so since the 60s, late 50s and 60s, you have the questions, well, maybe science can't answer everything. And we move from the more utopian look at possibilities um, to looking more carefully at a problem in the present, and trying to stop it to happen in the future. I mean, science fiction and dystopia, in fact, does not predict the future. It does not aim to. It aims at looking at the present. So all the books that we're reading really and ultimately are talking about things of concern here. Or maybe we wouldn't even understand them, what's going on. Science fiction and dystopian fiction in particular is ideal literature. It's talking about how to make things better in the present, by extrapolation of what might happen. And that's one of those whole things of a what if scenario that we find in science fiction. Now, the other kind of thing that I'm talking about is this basis here that you can look at in your papers. This basis in reality, because science fiction, as I said before, and in particular a dystopian fiction with its admonitions about what can go wrong if we continue in these ways, um, must, if we're going to really get into it, if we're going to buy in, if you will, must ground itself in the actualities and then thus the possibilities. Thus, a book, as strange as it might sound, um, uh, Unwind, which we haven't read yet, Unwind, as I've said before, takes its place from the huge fights that we have here, or confrontations, and the polarity between pro-life and I can't remember the other one now. It escapes me, probably because I'm so tired of the argument all the time. Anyway, it comes out in our book as pro abortions or um, anti-abortion. So you get, the words often sound quite similar, um, pro-choice and pro-life. A very, very, very nasty polarized speech. And there's a war. A homeland war is fought over those who want the government to, get out of it or ban it or whatever it is. It's plausible. It's plausible given um, the nastiness of the fight. Now, what makes it even more of interest has to do with the science of the matter here and the ability to, let's say, make it so that nobody suffered anything, no rejections anymore. And then you can look in there to see how it is, in fact, corrupted by the people in the know, in power. In fact, the woman that you meet, the old woman in the antique shop, her husband, in fact, developed a new technology, very easy to do, that can create organs, and you don't need these, late abortion, terms abortion, if you will, when someone's that age thing. And what do? The corporations destroy this guy because they don't want to lose any money. It has nothing to do with the politics of taking advantage thereof. The character who you can look into that really reveals this kinds of conscience of what really is going on is the admiral. Um, so you could even focus on him. But remember always, I've said before, that when you're dealing with technology in any of these books, there is a sense that what cures can also kill. And it's always been that way. More and more, we see it. New technologies, people take them, it turns out we have deformed babies. The whole question of genetic engineering that comes up won't go away, never will, because we have the capacities to do these things. And these books look into those possibilities, and that's the kind of thing you want to narrow in on. You take the big ideas, you deal with a character or with an idea, and you lay the foundation in that first paragraph. You reach conclusions in that first paragraph. People like to talk about thesis statements. I like the word assertion. And why is Connor important? Um, what is the role of the government? What is in Carbon Diaries? What purpose does a Hunger Game serve? Um, Look, for instance, at to things like, you know, the manner in which not only through the Hunger Games but other ways the people are controlled. Um, you have the Tesserae. Notice that the Tesserae protects those with the most. And this is very similar to what we're arguing about in the United States and Europe and other countries, in fact, is this huge difference between the haves and then the ever-increasing numbers of the have-nots. And, of course, Panem Capital is going to do everything it can to maintain the status quo. And you can see other ways that it's done to keep the people at bay. Fences. They don't necessarily have to work. Fences. Peacekeepers. What a wonderful euphemism for stormtroopers, if necessary. Every one of your stories has something like this going on. An orbit of possibilities from which to choose. So you want to narrow your focus to a central idea, and then you refer to plot elements by way of supporting your assertions. Um, and that way it gives you a reason to talk about what happens, what has happened, because you're not just saying, oh, this happens, yet people are repressed, this happens, but you can say, well, why is it significant for the novel? Perhaps in terms of the novel's assessment or investigation or contemplation of concerns we have today. You know, there are some powerful stories. There are powerful stories for adolescents, and the group that you have too. I don't think there's one really where the resolution just it makes everybody's the hero and they change the world on their own. That doesn't happen in any of our stories. It's talking about community and family. Um, and in a sense too that we find in the Hunger Games, it's a whole country. It's not just one person changing the world. Um, this is one of the reasons people don't like the ending a lot of times is the Hunger Games, because people get hurt. Certainly, our protagonist in Little Brother is hurt, is wounded. Perhaps not so much our fun-filled, snarky narrator of Carbon Diaries, but there again, um, there's a reckoning. Um, and what you have to to remember and you can work with is the extent to which a character with whom you deal in the story is very typical in many ways. You know, taking away all the other kinds of global things and stuff like that, we identify with most of our narrators because they are and experience things as teenagers, as adolescents. They're worried about friendship, the girls, all these things. And that really is the key that opens up the stories to us. And you can look into that area as well. Um, but basically, you have to narrow the focus. You have to come to conclusions. You have an argument to make. And then the rest of the essay, you supply the information, the evidence to support what you're doing. And be aware, for instance, here of how to use a quotation. I've talked about it before, but don't ever just throw a quotation in and let it sit there. A quotation from the story is not, you're not retelling the story, so it doesn't stand alone or it goes without saying. In your essays, use quotations to support something you've said. If you're arguing that trying to think of it, that um, Matt looks down upon himself and feels inadequate, and you say, for instance, in the following quotation, he calls himself a coward while he's bashing his face, and then you have a colon and you have the quotation, so that supports what you're saying about, in this case, the transition and all of it, how in the story young Todd Pup, goes through his experiences and becomes, um, you know, I want to get away from the whole idea of a man. His own person, I think, would be a better way of looking at it, especially in terms of the gender issues involved with man and woman and all these other kinds of things. Um, I like the whole question of information. Notice in the government doesn't supply correct information in a book like Carbon Diaries, and the information is controlled completely, if possible, in Hunger Games, um, um, manipulated in our story of Little Brother. This whole thing about the information, you know, we're doing this to protect your security. The information that goes out that says these people who are doing this stuff, you know, are terrorizing, they're connected with Al Qaeda because they're messing with the way in which the powers that be are trying to control everybody. And a lot of people, they're thinking they're doing the right thing. Don't get me wrong there, but this is about the use and abuse of power, technology, and things along those lines. So you'll find that Captain Prentice, Major, excuse me, is it Major? Uh, who's named a whole town after himself and has killed all the women. Um, his goal is to control completely information and the story, the narrative of what goes on. And he does it through power, and of course, he does it through fear and other kinds of things. He's trying um, it's an abuse of power, but really about information, about what people are allowed to know, about what people are told is the truth. And you're going to find Unwind, this continues the story, not quite as much. And in the last story, in a big way, the corporate use to change even the anthem of the place. I just love it. So at any rate, you know, you don't have that much time. If you for your papers, if you find some information on the internet, do not just cut and paste because that's plagiarism. But you know, you might find reinforcement on some page about themes, or even the quotations, if you will. Some of you have been noting on the stories we read. Just so make use of what you have. But the big idea is make assertions in that first paragraph, reach conclusions, get your big idea out there, and then in the remaining paragraphs, in or fashion in a way that one paragraph leads logically to the next, develop your thing. If you can think of four major big ideas associated with Todd in the context of information, develop it through the paragraphs, one after the other, saving the big thing until the end, if you will, so that you have continuity as you move from idea to idea. Well, anyway, again, look over the ones that I provided from the other class, and also the video that's there about doing what I call book analysis reports. That's what you're doing here. And have fun. But remember, narrow the focus. Don't try to cover, I'm going to talk about the whole book, because you're not going to do anything except offer a thing. And then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. That's not what you want in this. You want logical development, critical analysis. And that means you have to think about how everything you're writing is related. One paragraph to the next, all the paragraphs to the ideas that you establish in the introduction. And use your best grammar. I'll get these back to you as fast as I can, but from the look of things, not many people will have a chance to revise, which is okay. And I'll give you as much feedback as I can.